Hey guys, a lot of you have been asking how I've been doing with my health, so I thought I would just sneak away into the other room and give you guys a quick little update on how everything's going with me this year. First of all, I appreciate all of your text messages and your phone calls and your little messages that you guys have sent to me just expressing concern over my health, so thank you guys very much for doing that. And so I thought the easiest way to kind of bring everybody up to date would be to make a little video and then post it for you guys to see. And then I realized some of you don't know the whole story of what's happened this last year, so I'm gonna backtrack it a little bit and bring you guys all up to speed so you can know what's been happening. So last January, not last January, this January, but we are almost in January again. So January of 2019, I had a flu shot, and I have never had a flu shot before, ever. This was my very first flu shot. We did it because our son, Asher, gets croup really bad, and we spent the better part of last winter in the hospital with him with his croup. So we thought, well, let's try to do the flu shot. Let's try to not have the flu this year and try to stay out of the hospital as much as we can and try to get his croup under control. So we all went and got our flu shot. For the record, he didn't have the flu, if you're wondering. That worked. But I, however, it didn't go so well in my system. So about 4 hours after I had the flu shot, we were sitting in a restaurant, and I just remember the whole world starting to spin and my body feeling miserable. And so I told Tim I needed to go home. So we left the restaurant, and I came home and I went to bed, and I didn't ever really get back out of bed again, probably for a good few months. I felt like I had the flu, so when I called the pharmacist to ask if this was a normal reaction, he assured me that it was probably just another flu that I had just coincidentally had picked up at the same time as the flu shot, completely unrelated, and just go about my business. Problem was, it kept getting worse and worse and worse, and my body was in so much pain in my joints and in my muscles that I could hardly tolerate the pain. And then my brain, I just had a lot of brain fog. I actually don't remember a whole lot that went down in the first few months after all of this began. It's pretty blurry. So I went off to see my GP after a few weeks of struggling, and he got me in to see a rheumatologist, and while we were waiting, he ran some blood work, and he put me on prednisone, a low dose, a baby dose actually, of prednisone. He wanted to do a 5-day window of prednisone just to see if we could knock back some of the inflammation and the pain. And what happened was I also had an adverse reaction to the prednisone. So definitely from the point of the prednisone on, my memory is shot. There was about a 2-week window in there where I really don't remember much, except that I thought I was dying. I was just getting weaker and weaker. I could feel my heart starting to slow. My blood pressure was dangerously low. And that was from an overdose of prednisone, but the overdose was actually just a baby dose, and I never made it the full run. I only made it 3 days, but it just wouldn't clear my system, and it just built up way too high. So I finally was able to see the rheumatologist, and he suggested that I had what was called palindromic rheumatism. He did not think it was related to the vaccine. He decided it was palindromic rheumatism, which was kind of, the markers in my blood showed that I had rheumatoid factor. So he assumed that I probably had rheumatoid that just hadn't settled into the joints yet, and that once it settled, that I would probably have some joints that would chronically ache and the rest of it would start to disappear. So his solution was to try me on a different medication. It took about 3 weeks on that medication before it also built up and gave me adverse side effects to the point where I also couldn't leave home again. When I tried calling him and asking him if he had any other solutions, that was kind of the end of the line for him. He didn't offer me anything else. So we were pretty discouraged at that point, and prayed about it and felt like I was just gonna have to fight for my own health when the medical system wasn't offering help. So I ended up seeing a naturopath and calling, really he's an old friend of ours. He's been an acupuncturist and Chinese herbalist who's worked with our family for many years. Called him. He was able to give me some Chinese herbs that helped with the pain and his explanation for what this was. And then I saw a naturopath as well, and she worked alongside of the herbalist, and she put me on a bunch of different supplements to help my brain, because part of the problem was that on top of the pain, I actually lost short-term memory, so I'd be in the middle of a task and I would just completely forget where I was or what I was doing. And even now, if you guys have noticed, I actually am a little bit slower to put my sentences together. So if we're talking and I just suddenly slow down or take a deep breath, it's just because I need my brain to catch up. That's one of the things that has still continued to linger. So we knew we were kind of getting somewhere with the natural route, but I still didn't have an explanation to what this was. So I was praying and more like pleading. Yep, we were desperate, and pouring it out to God, saying, like, he knew what this was. I knew he knew what this was, and I needed an answer because I knew I needed to have some resolution. So one night after praying, I pulled up my laptop, and on my laptop I had not one but two tabs open of Safari that was explaining this thing called, now it's an acronym called ASIA, but the long version of it is autoimmune anti-inflammatory syndrome induced by an adjuvant. Look it up if you don't know what it is. And it matched perfectly every symptom that I had. And because God is funny and he knows me, he also had this second tab behind it. So when I closed the first one, the other one was right there with more symptoms. And the second tab had the doctor's name. There was no escaping this at this point. I couldn't escape what was on my computer. And so I looked up the doctor's name who was at the bottom of this article, who had figured out this thing called ASIA. And he was still alive, and he lives in Israel. And it was super late at night, and there was an email to contact him, and I thought, I'm just gonna reach out to him and tell him what's happening. Well, it turns out the time of night that I sent the email to Israel, from Canada to Israel, was the very time that he was getting on shift for the day and was checking his email. So I actually got a very fast response back to him. I had one before I went to bed that night, and told me that he worked alongside of a man from another doctor from Finland who had come to finish his research here in Canada, and to track him down, and he would be able to help me in my own country. So I looked up this doctor's name, and it turns out that he's in the same city as us. So God was pretty miraculous when he worked all this out and revealed what it was, and got me in contact with this doctor in Israel, who got me the name of a doctor who was right here in my own city, who specialized in this very thing that God showed me on the internet. So I went off to my GP and I asked for a referral in to see this doctor, and I have now just seen him. So this brings you up to speed with where a lot of you are following now. You know, I've been on this waiting list to see this specialist, and I've finally seen him. And it was hilarious because the week before he went in, my husband said, "Oh, I just wish that we could see like a Dr. House." I don't know if any of you guys watch House on TV, but he's like, "We just need a Dr. House who can figure out this mystery." And so we're sitting in the waiting room, and all of a sudden this man walks out with a cane and running shoes and jeans and a button-down shirt and disheveled gray hair, and he calls my name. And it was this doctor we've been waiting to see. what's even funnier is we later learned that he doesn't usually walk with a cane. He had just slipped on the ice the day before, and for 2 days he used a cane to help him walk. And we just thought it was funny that God had heard even Tim's prayer of just, I need to see a Dr. House to know that this is gonna be okay, kind of thing. And there he was. So we went in and we saw this man, and he was phenomenal. He had pulled up my entire medical profile, because it's all online now, and he knew everything about my life as far back as those online records would show. And he had no desire to rush. He had no desire to give me a medication and get me out the door. He actually wanted to listen and hear how I was doing. And he knew my symptoms before I said my symptoms. He said, so you have this, 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 and this. And I said, yes. And he said, and how about this one? I'll give you an example. He said, you're probably not sleeping very well at night. And I said, no, but I just assumed that was because I don't really sleep well at the best of times, but it's probably been a little worse. And he said, well, it would be worse because that all goes with your symptoms. And at the end of it, so things just like that where I didn't even assume that it was part of what was going on in my body, but he linked it all together. And at the end of it, he said, you are a textbook example of having Asia. And so it is this adjuvant-induced autoimmune, which means when I had the flu vaccine, my body created an autoimmune response, which for the record is very rare. So if you're wondering, I'm not going to tell you whether or not you should or shouldn't do flu shots. That's not, I'm just telling you my story. But Asia, I will tell you, is very rare. And so he said that I do have this, and that the blood work also showed that I probably have a second autoimmune somewhere hidden in there, maybe rheumatoid. The blood work still looks like there's probably some rheumatoid, but he wasn't sure how much of this was one autoimmune and how much was the other autoimmune. So the grand thing that he has given me is an insanely high dose of vitamin D once a week, and some melatonin to help my serotonin levels in my brain. And he's hopeful that the vitamin D in these large doses once a week will be enough to shut off the switch on not one but two of my autoimmunes. He's hoping by the time I see him again in February that some of my symptoms will have disappeared. And a lot of you know I've also had to switch my diet. So I'm eating paleo food. If you're familiar with it, it was the closest I could get to what I was already eating. And there's very fortunately lots of people who've gone ahead and already made recipes, and it really helped me figure out how to eat again once I could put it into a category. So I'm paleo, but I'm not, I'm a nightshade-free paleo because nightshades are inflammatory, and I'm trying to reduce an inflammatory response in my system. So that's how I've been eating. He asked me to continue to eat like that, knowing that food was going to help. And that was his grand prescription, was vitamin D, melatonin, eating well. I want a probiotic. That was it. So I'm part of a research project with him now, understanding chronic fatigue, which also comes with this. I'm exhausted all the time. So he's analyzing chronic fatigue and food and everything else that goes together with all of this. So I'm part of a research project now to help them understand this better. So there's kind of the update. I see him again in February. How's my body feeling? That's what I get a lot. How am I feeling? Exhausted. I'm tired. That has been a whirlwind of a year. 2019 was rotten. It was a lot of time in bed. It was in and out of the hospital. At one point, my blood pressure had dropped so low that I couldn't stand up. At another point, I remember laying in bed and suddenly I was looking over top of my body and I watched my heart stop before I hollered at God, no, I don't want to go yet. And I clambered back into my body and spent that night in prayer that God would heal me. And I've no doubt at this point that He has spared my life numerous times. I am here by His grace. I am here by His power, and I have seen miracles this year like you would not believe. At the end of 2018, in about December, I remember I had prayed, Lord, I just want to know that you still do miracles. And then all this happened, and I remember laying in bed thinking, that's kind of the opposite of a miracle, Lord. I feel like our connections got a little mixed up there. But I remember telling that to a lady this year, and she said, I wouldn't be so sure about that. And you know, she was right. I can tell you that God can bring people back from the dead, because I am fairly certain the night I watched my heart stop, I was going to die. My dad called the next morning and said, are you okay? Because I was woken up in the middle of the night to pray for you, and it felt like your life was in danger. So God woke up my dad to pray for me that I would have life when I was watching my heart stop. So I have seen miracles, and I share all this with you. One, to bring you all up to date, but I also couldn't leave it without a message of hope. And before I get there, because I never really answered how am I doing other than tired, pain-wise, the food that I have been eating, so I switched over to paleo at the end of February, and I have been eating that way ever since, and mostly I have good days. With the weather turning cold, I notice it in my feet and my hands. There's pain in my joints. And and then other than that, it's mostly just the fatigue. And also, because I have these autoimmunes, I have to be super careful to not get sick. Otherwise, my body ramps up the response again. So if you're sick and we were supposed to do coffee or hang out or get our kids together, please cancel. And I won't be upset, because I can't afford to be sick. I've been sick. I'm getting over a cold right now. This is a 2-week-long cold, because that's how long it takes my system. And it was quite painful getting through the cold. So that brings you up to speed. If you're watching, I'm not a doctor. So if you have some ailments, some health problems that sound familiar, I would encourage you to reach out to your doctor or naturopath or whatever form you want. Do not do what they have prescribed for me, because you need to go on your own journey and you need to seek medical advice. So that is my one catch. Do not listen to my medical advice. I am not a doctor. Okay, but I wanted to leave you guys with a little bit of hope. And this has been my hope through the year. Just before I had my flu vaccine, just before all this chaos hit, we have been studying the book of James, and it has been my anchor through all of this. So I want to read from James chapter 1, verses 2 to 4. So he says, count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. I have learned to have joy in all of my trials, because at the end of everything that I know, at the end of my limits, where I run out of me, is where I have seen God the most spectacularly do his thing. And I have come to know God in a way that I haven't before. I didn't know how much I needed him until I couldn't function without him. When there were days when I had to wake up and pray before I could put my feet on the ground out of my bed, it was just confirmation that he is so much more capable than I ever gave him credit for. He has held the fragility of my life in his hands and still provided. He has shown me answers. He has found me doctors that will listen, and he has just provided and given comfort and healed. There was a night my hands hurt so bad. I couldn't tolerate it anymore. And Mia came in, that's my oldest daughter, and she laid her hands on my hands where they had hurt, and she prayed, and the pain was gone by the time she was done. Guys, like, pray for healing. You can pray for healing with confidence, and you can pray for life, and you can pray for answers, and you can pray for all of these things because God listens. And we're so used to holding so much of ourselves. We hold it in our hands so tightly, and you can let go. Like, you can really trust God. I have learned to trust him. And so I was reading this verse with my daughters this week, and one of my daughters said, "So what is faith?" She said, "What does it mean, a testing of your faith? And what does it mean that it's going to be perfected and completed?" So we flipped back to Hebrews, where it says, this is Hebrews 11, "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen." Faith is where our 5 senses run out, and we have to depend on God's promises and trust him. And that's what gets made perfect when we're in a trial. And that's why we can have joy, because our faith is being strengthened, because we're at the end of our line, and yet God steps in and does his thing, and we see his power, and we trust him, and we can rest inside of those promises because he is a good God, and because he is taking care of us. And so when we count it all joy in our trials, we can count it all joy because we know that God is in charge, and we know that we are going to see him wildly like we have never seen him before. And so this year, I say, has been hard, but on the flip side of that, this year has provided me with such a deep understanding of the capabilities of God and how much power he has. So I actually, in spite of all of it, and whether or not I ever make a recovery, I am so content to just get up every morning and trust that he holds the day, and he holds my life, and he holds everybody's life around me, and I can trust that. And it's something, in spite of all the fatigue that I have, it's something I can rest in. And so I wanted to leave you with that hope at the end of the update. And thank you again to all of you who have been reaching out. I very much appreciate it. It's wonderful to know that you guys care so much about what's going on in my world. So thank you, and I hope you guys all have a blessed day. Bye-bye.